Hello, everyone. You'll see that there's a handout for this week. It will help you follow along. Let me send it one more time. You can find it, of course, on the website if you need to. So, as you'll see from the handout, I'm thinking the story today is coming in four parts. First of all, I want to say what a pragmatic metavocabulary is. Second, I want to say why I think the way forward in thinking about pragmatic metavocabularies is to think of them as a kind of normative vocabulary. Then I want to say why a normative pragmatic metavocabulary should be two-dimensional rather than merely binary. The norm involved should not just be, is this okay or not okay, appropriate or inappropriate. It should have two substantially different deontic flavors involved in it. Third, and this is maybe the central topic for the day, I want to talk about asserting as the core performance kind of discursive practices. How to understand assertion as a pragmatic significance that performances can have, why we should think of that as demarcating the discursive. That is why having some performances that have the significance of assertions, of claimings that things are thus and so, should be the criterion that we use to determine whether something is a discursive practice, a linguistic practice. And why asserting is essentially, and not just accidentally, a move in a game of giving and asking for reasons. That is why making a claim, asserting something, and giving and assessing reasons for it and against it are two sides of one coin. Any practice that has the one of them in it should have the other. And then at the end, I want to go back and look at Kant's views to try and catch him saying some of the things or giving us the original ideas that get elaborated in this account of assertion. That's a bit of an extra story. Normally, when I tell the story, I would start with Kant and sort of work our way forward. Here, I think it's will work better to talk about how I'm thinking about language, and then at the end go back and say, yeah, and we can see how these ideas are rooted in Kant. So let me look forward a little bit to how this is going to fit into the rest of the course. The thing I think that it's most important to have in mind from last time is the distinction that Harman motivates between reasoning practices and what I call reason relations, between, as he puts it, inferring or inference, something you can do, and relations of implication, which are not themselves doings, but govern, today I'll say normatively govern those doings. Remember, this was in connection with his claim that there is no such thing as deductive inference. If there were, a paradigm would be, if you believe P and believe if P then Q, then you ought to believe Q. But he says, maybe you have better evidence against Q than you have for either of the two premises, then you should give one of them up. What there really is deductive relations of implication, and they constrain. They tell you don't believe all of P if P then Q and not Q. But that only constrains, it doesn't determine what you ought to do. Now, what the discussion of pragmatics is aiming at next week is an understanding of those reason relations in terms of the doings, to get a more articulated picture of how those reason relations can be understood in terms of the functional role that they play in the pragmatics, in the use of the language. And then going on in the course, we'll look at structural properties of the two fundamental kinds of reason relations. So I'll just say, I'm argue that there are two kinds of reason relation, not just the implication that Harman talks about, but also incompatibility. And one of the structural issues is, well, why are there two, and why just two, and why just those two? Those are the things we'll be worrying about in a couple of weeks. And then we'll see how to introduce logical vocabulary to make explicit those reason relations, paradigmatically introducing conditionals to make implications explicit, that is explicit in the sense of assertable, something you can say, and negation to make incompatibility relations explicit as something sayable. And then moving still farther on in the course, we'll see how Kit finds truthmaker semantics underwrites reason relations like that. How one of the points, I'll argue the principal point of the semantics, is to explain to us what implication and incompatibility are. That's not the way Kit is thinking about things. And then moving on further, we'll look at Ulf Loebel's isomorphism between the bilateralist normative pragmatic metavocabulary that I'll introduce next week and its account of reason relations, saying what the turnstile means, what incompatibility means, on the one hand, and the truthmaker representationalist semantic metavocabulary with its account of reason relations. On the other hand, Loebel has this fabulous result showing how to move back and forth between these, and then on to the implicational semantics, Dan Kaplan's implicational semantics, that is internal and intrinsic to reason relations and shows how to make sense of Ulf's isomorphism, of what's in common between the bilateralist pragmatic metavocabulary and the truthmaker representational semantic metavocabulary. And my overall goal is to make sense of the notion of a vocabulary, of this generalization of a language in terms of this constellation, the applicability of this constellation of metavocabularies, a bilateralist normative pragmatic metavocabulary, a truthmaker semantic metavocabulary, a logical metavocabulary, and sort of at the core of that, the implication space semantics that's intrinsic to the reason relations, emerging as a core of it. So what I'm after is a reason-centered metavocabulary for this crucial set of metavocabularies. So it's really a metavocabulary of reasons that I'm claiming illuminates discursive practice. And I think of my two earlier philosophy of language books, Making It Explicit and Between Saying and Doing, as offering different metavocabularies, aiming to do something like the same job. And this third one, that, as I said, getting all its meat from these results by Loebel and Kaplan, are suitably informed, I trust, by that earlier work I've done, but let us do some things much better than I was able to do before. So that's where we're going. What I'm going to be presenting today is not material from this new book, The Reasons for Logic, Logic for Reasons. We'll get to that next week. This is the background considerations, for instance, material that I present in those two earlier books that are setting some of the framework for it. So I'd like to start by saying something about the notion of a pragmatic metavocabulary. We'll come to a more specific, detailed account of it, the one that comes with the pretty picture in the handout, after a bit. So the notion of a meta-language is due to Tarski. He began with the idea of what Carnap would call syntactic meta-languages. And Tarski was thinking of Hilbert's formalism, where Hilbert wanted to do mathematics, understanding it entirely in terms of syntactic operations. So Tarski, looking back at Hilbert's program, said, I see formalism is wanting to understand mathematics in terms of syntactic meta-languages. And this was still the idea that Carnap had when he published what's probably his most important work, The Logical Syntax of Language. As that title suggests, Carnap was still using exclusively syntactic meta-languages at that point. But Tarski, taking his inspiration from Gödel's completeness, and especially his incompleteness results, where Gödel not only had a syntactic meta-language in that he could talk about expressions in the language and how they combined, but also could talk about truth in it, could talk about what those expressions referred to. And Tarski, in his famous work on truth in the late 1930s, came up with what Carnap would then call the notion of semantic meta-languages that let us talk about truth and denotation. And this was very important for the Vienna Circle, who downstream from Wittgenstein's claim in the Tractatus that you could not talk about what it is that a sentence has in common with what makes it true, in virtue of which the sentence is about that fact or state of affairs. That was something that could only be shown, it couldn't be said. This was very worrisome to the Vienna Circle. Here was this crucial notion of how language hooked onto the world that the Tractatus was telling us you can't talk or think about. But Tarski, Carnap thought, had showed that that wasn't true, that the notion of semantic metavocabularies, meta-languages, he says, that let us talk precisely about the relation between a sentence and what makes it true. Those were perfectly intelligible and tractable, formally tractable notions. In the early 1950s, Sellers was thinking hard about Carnap. Carnap had opened his eyes to what Sellers called the new way of words. And Sellers introduced the notion of a pragmatic metavocabulary, by which he meant, he's still using the notion of a meta-language, of a pragmatic meta-language, which he means one that lets us talk about what we're doing when we're talking. A pragmatic metalanguage is going to let us talk about practices, discursive linguistic practices. For instance, the very notion of assertion is a notion in a pragmatic metalanguage. Now, I think this notion of a pragmatic metalanguage is at the core of Sellers' contribution philosophically. We'll talk later about his metalinguistic turn, but he learned from Carnap to think of many, if not most, philosophical problems as really problems about metalanguages. And in particular, he comes to think of, he's very impressed by Carnap's analysis of the statement triangularity is a property, that understands it as a disguised way of saying is triangular is a one-place predicate. He thought it was a disguised metalinguistic remark and didn't require us to postulate spooky universals like triangularity. But Sellers pushed this farther and understood even a lethic modal discourse, talk about necessity and possibility, as he put it, covertly metalinguistic. And I claim that to make sense of that notion of the metalinguistic, Sellers needs the notion of a pragmatic metalanguage. But for reasons that are not clear, he stops talking about that by the end of the 50s. And when he's doing the core of his work, he drops this phrase. We don't hear it again. And so I'm sort of reviving this notion from 70 years ago that he had. I talked last time a little bit about why I use vocabulary instead of language. For now, I think it's enough to say, I think the term language should be restricted to autonomous discursive practices. In Wittgensteinian terms, language games one could play, though one played no other. And none of these metalanguages are languages in that sense. They're all essentially parasitic on the languages that they're metalanguages for. None of them would be autonomous. They're essentially fragments of any autonomous discourse. I think it makes sense to think about them as vocabularies, and though I'll say more about this in weeks to come, to use the notion of vocabulary to cover both autonomous discursive practices and fragments of them, like pragmatic, semantic, and logical vocabularies. If we think about pragmatic metavocabularies as vocabularies that let us talk about what we're doing when we're saying things, really, we don't need a lot of high theory to see how pragmatic and semantic metavocabularies are different. Sellers, my hero, talks about the notorious ing-ed ambiguity that he saw as plaguing philosophy, that terms like representation are ambiguous between representings and representeds, and he thinks that this is pervasive in the historical tradition. Talk about perception or experience, ambiguous between the perceiving and what's perceived, the experiencing and what's experienced. He diagnoses, for instance, Bishop Berkeley as systematically confusing experience in the sense of experiencings, mental events, and experience in the sense of what's experienced. At any rate, there's an ordinary language distinction between what's said and the saying of it, between what's thought and the thinking of it. What's represented and the representing of it. That's the ing-ed ambiguity between an act and a content is the way it's normally put. And we can think of the semantic metavocabularies as aiming at an account of the contents, what's represented, what's thought, what's said, or we could say sayable, thinkable, representable on the one hand, and think about pragmatic metavocabularies as addressing the activity, the act, the saying, the thinking, the representing. So that rough and ready distinction doesn't require, I want to say, high theory to pick out the topics. I mean, as soon as we want to say something more specific about what discursive practice is, or what how to think about the conceptual contents that I think we should think of as conferred upon expressions by the role that they play in practices of using them, the topic of pragmatic metavocabularies. As soon as we get more specific about what the criteria of adequacy of such accounts are, what terms should be taken as basic and which derived in explaining it, then we're in the middle of serious theoretical commitments. But just to understand the difference in topics, we don't need to. Now, one of the big issues that arises as soon as we do try and be a little more specific about pragmatic metavocabularies, like what sort of terms are in that vocabulary? What can we say about the vocabulary we use to talk about what we're doing, about the use rather than the meaning of our expressions? Is whether a pragmatic metavocabulary can be couched in naturalistic terminology, or whether it requires normative vocabulary. Now, there are big issues that arise immediately in trying to characterize what a naturalistic vocabulary is, what a normative vocabulary is. Some people are naturalists in a sense that restricts them to using the language of fundamental physics, or at any rate, commits them to saying that everything that's sayable, or everything that is respectably sayable anyway, is saying something that can be said in the language of fundamental physics. That's a very strong claim. Other people are more relaxed. They say, well, the special sciences doesn't have to be fundamental physics. And some people are happy enough just to say ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary is naturalistic vocabulary enough. But almost everyone who thinks of themselves as a naturalist excludes at least some kind of normative vocabulary from that. That's sort of the contrast class. And I'm going to claim anyway that for it to be discursive practice that one is characterizing, one needs to use a normative vocabulary in one's pragmatic metavocabulary. And I'll be saying something about what kind of normative vocabulary I think one needs to know, one needs to use. One of my dearest pragmatist fellow travelers, Hugh Price, whose distinction between subject naturalism and object naturalism I'll be talking about in a few minutes, is a naturalist in this sense. He is committed to being able to do his pragmatics in a naturalistic vocabulary. This is the place where he and I diverge. Now, in fact, though I think it's useful to organize the issue here as a choice to be made between a naturalistic and a normative metavocabulary, and I'm happy to announce myself as one of the friends of the norms, as being on the normative side. In fact, my view is less anti-naturalist than it might seem. What I claim is you have to underwrite normative characterizations of what we're doing in order for us to see what we're doing as semantically contentful, as saying that things are thus and so. But I'm happy enough if one tells then a certain kind of story about the use of that normative vocabulary, even a naturalistic story about the use of that vocabulary. That's not the kind of story I tell, but I don't take it that the considerations I put forward rule that out. And this is the via media that I have offered to Hugh Price. It's where I think the work of the very best teleosemanticists, and I take the most sophisticated version of that to be Ruth Milliken's work. I take her to be offering, first of all, a normative pragmatic metavocabulary, and then second of all, a naturalistic account of those norms. And I don't take it that the considerations always rule out that sort of story. So naturalism maybe, but it comes in much later and in a somewhat surprising way, in a way we'll only understand when we see Price's distinction between subject and object naturalism. Okay, so where I want to go next is to talk about why you might think that normative vocabulary is needed to characterize discursive practice, and then move on to say what kind of normative vocabulary I think one should use for that. So the reason I had you read chapter 1 of Making It Explicit is because I'm making this case in more detail. I'm not just going to rehearse those considerations today. Though I'm going to get to the Kant only at the end. Let me remind you that last time I did tell a story about Kant's normative revolution, followed by Frege arguing that logic, anyway, is a normative discipline, as he put it, and Wittgenstein having as one of his, the later Wittgenstein having as one of his central insights the normativity of discursive practice. I talked about his example of teaching the children a game in that case, and mentioned, I'll remind you, Cavell's bon mot that Kant depsychologized epistemology, Frege depsychologized logic, and Wittgenstein depsychologized psychology, where depsychologizing is appreciating the normative dimension, the dimension that is not just a matter of describing what people do. But I think in our time, one good way into this topic, the way that has made, that caught the attention of Anglophone analytic philosophers was Kripke's book on Wittgenstein on following a rule. this book that came out in 1980 kicked off what's now a vast literature on what, following Boghossian, has come to be called the rule-following considerations. And that has shaped the discussion of the normativity of meaning, or as Alan Gibbard taught us to say more precisely, the claim that the concept of meaning is a normative concept. I'll say it's the claim that only a normative characterization of what we're doing in using expressions will support the attribution of meanings to them, of conceptual content to them. It's because it is so controversial, the extent to which Kripke has actually rehearsed Wittgenstein's arguments, as opposed to putting something new in there. It's become canonical to refer to these, to refer to the author of these views as Kripkenstein. Kripke is officially not speaking in his own voice. He attributes everything to Wittgenstein, just so as to bracket the issue about how Wittgensteinian this is. We talk about Kripkenstein. As I say, this has kicked off a vast literature. I think it's worth keeping in mind, in passing, the origins of this book of Kripke's. He was Kripke, my teacher at Princeton. He was an undergraduate at Harvard, 2 years younger than all of the others, because he had proved the completeness of all the Lewis modal systems when he was 14. And in his senior year, he had a special status of Scholar of the House, which meant that all of his grades were going to be determined by one big project that he did, which he wrote with Quine. And in the spring, on the day that this large paper was due, he had not shown up to turn it in. And so Quine made the trek to his dormitory and walked up the stairs and knocked on the door. So I'll open the door. Oh, Professor Quine, today's the day that paper is due. And Kripke said, yeah, I was supposed to be doing this. The paper was due, and turned around at his desk and shuffled around and finally pulled out a manuscript and said, well, maybe this will do. That was the manuscript that he then published in 1980 as the book Wittgenstein on Following a Rule. Every word in it that was not in his Harvard paper, he put in footnotes. The rest of that was what he wrote as a 19-year-old. So a genius, intimidating. The way Kripkenstein sets things out, meaning is a normative concept in the sense that claims about meaning have necessary conditions that have to be formulated in a normative vocabulary. So in the example that he uses, if you mean plus by that cross symbol, then if you're asked what's 7 plus 5, you should answer 12. I would say, you're committed to answering 12. He would say, it would be correct for you to answer 12. Well, what you ought to say, what you're committed to say, what it would be correct to say, those are all normative matters. And the claim is that meaning, saying something with a particular meaning, necessarily and not just accidentally has consequences that are formulable in normative terms. Remember, in the later Wittgenstein example that I gave last time, he was showing that a request, teach the children a game, has normative consequences. It draws a line between, it implicitly draws a line between things that are responsive, are correct responses fulfilling the request, and those that aren't. Wittgenstein is arguing that beliefs are like that. So if by chair, you mean, if by the English word chair, you mean chair, then you should count something that is a chair otherwise as still a chair, even if it's placed directly under the center of the Eiffel Tower. Even if perhaps no chair has ever been in that particular position, and nobody's ever accordingly used the word in that circumstance, if by chair, by the word chair, you mean chair, you should say, yes, this that is a chair would still be a chair, even if it were directly under the Eiffel Tower. But what is it, he asks then, that determines the boundary of that norm? It seems that all there is the past uses that you've made of it. And yet, how can that work? How can past actual uses have determined how it's correct to use the term in novel circumstances, in circumstances where people have never used it before? That's Wittgenstein's question. He poses it, what facts is it about the prior use by you or by everybody, same considerations come in, that determine how it's correct to go on, given the meaning that you have conferred on this expression by the use you have made of it in the past. I mean, if you haven't read the Kripke book, it's a short book, I recommend it. There is a collection of essays on the rule-following considerations. It's the title of it, that Paul Boghossian edited, if you want to catch up a little on the literature of that. I've argued elsewhere that the solution to that question, the response to that question that Kripke attributes to Wittgenstein, not only isn't Wittgenstein's, but doesn't work in its own terms. Kripke claims that he puts no restrictions on, in effect, the language you use to specify the prior usage that has to determine this norm. But in fact, it's clear that he considers it would be question begging to use normative language to do it. So that he's in fact challenged us to describe in non-normative vocabulary features of the use that are sufficient to institute a genuine norm. And that passage from is to ought is what he thinks Wittgenstein is raising. I mean, Wittgenstein is raising issues in the vicinity, but I would say not that one exactly. But Wittgenstein does. And his observation then that meaning is a normative concept and that puts constraints on, in effect, what vocabulary you can use in describing the use of the expression that will be sufficient to confer a normative significance on it. I mentioned last time that Quine criticized Carnap for carrying over to the treatment of natural language considerations that really only applied to artificial languages. So in artificial languages, we can simply stipulate the association of a meaning with an expression. But Quine says in the case of natural language, all there is to make our words mean what they mean is the way we actually use them. I say actually use them. Dispositions are not sufficient here. That's one of the arguments that Kripkenstein does pick up from Wittgenstein. In making it explicit, I suggest that there's a dilemma that we're being presented with, a Scylla and a Charybdis, two monsters from the Odyssey. And one is regularism. That's the view that we can just look at non-normatively characterized regularities in our early behavior, in our previous behavior, at the dispositions, say, that we had to use expressions in order to see them as conferring normative significance that stretches out to new cases. And here, Kripke, following Wittgenstein, argues that isn't going to underwrite a robust enough notion of getting it wrong, of using the expression incorrectly. On the one hand, it could be that you just are disposed to make mistakes. So the fact that you systematically make certain kinds of mistakes in addition does not mean that you really don't mean plus by plus. It means you make mistakes. Crispin Wright, early on in this discussion, said that these dispositional accounts only work for individuals, that individuals go wrong or right depending on the communal dispositions, and that you're making a mistake is you're being out of step, in effect. Individuals can go right or wrong, he said, the community just goes. McDowell, responding to his longtime friend and cohort, member of his cohort, Wright, then said, but in fact, we think we could all be wrong about the use of something. We think we're making objective claims that are true or false depending on how things really are. Not his example, but even if we all convinced ourselves that the mass of the universe was large enough that it would eventually gravitationally collapse, we could just be wrong about that. And the normativity has to, that we underwrite has to be robust enough to get that. If you look at regularities, the problem is that for any finite initial segment of use of an expression, there's an infinite number of ways of going on in the same way. This is the gerrymandering argument, that no finite amount of applications fixes one regularity out of all of them that are instantiated by it. And this argument we certainly find in Wittgenstein. What's come to be called disjunctivitis is a special case. What if all of us have only ever seen adult porcupines or male porcupines? Is that enough and would not be disposed to call the female, or that let's say is dimorphic, looks quite different, or the babies, porcupines. Does that mean that we can't mean porcupine? That we can only mean porcupine of the kinds we have observed so far? When we have never seen an Australian echidna that also has spikes like a porcupine, was it impossible for us to mean porcupine rather than porcupine or echidna by the expressions that we used? There's a battery of arguments against mere regularities or dispositions invoking norms. That's one horn of the dilemma. What I call the regulist horn of the dilemma, rather than regularist because it's regularities, regulist because regula means rules in Latin. And Wittgenstein considers, well, maybe for adding, what makes it adding and determines all of this is that I can define adding in terms of counting. To add n and m, first count to n, and then count m more times and see where you got. That's what I mean by adding. And he argues there, and this is again, at least picking up an argument that really is in Wittgenstein. Yeah, but isn't that circular? You're just putting the question off on counting. How do we know that by counting you mean counting, and not something that if you get high enough diverges from it? So you can't say it's determined by rules because that's circular, or embarks you on a regress. And you can't say it's just a regularity because that underdetermines the norms that we have. So what are you going to do? Never mind what Wittgenstein thought. It's pretty clear that in Wittgenstein, the idea is that we need something that is more than mere regularities described non-normatively, and less than norms that are explicit in the form of rules. What we need is the notion of a norm that's implicit in a practice. So Wittgenstein asks us to think about what it is in virtue of the way we use signposts, that the signpost, which considered just as a piece of wood has no normative significance, actually counts as pointing one way and not another. And he says, well, it's the way we have learned to respond to them, the way we teach our children to respond to them. It's the customs, uses, practices, institutions that implicitly bring into play a norm. And what the argument against regularism is showing is that any explicit rule requires norms of application to determine how it's correctly applied in novel circumstances. That is, it's only against the background of norms implicit in practice that you can make sense of norms that are explicit in rules that determine what's correct by saying what's correct. And that's a debate into which teleosemanticists like Ruth Millikan, David Papineau, Kim Sterelny, or other worthy contributors to this way of thinking. At this point, they say, well, no, actually, there's another way we could go besides thinking of norms implicit in social practice. And it's a good question how Wittgenstein wants us to think and talk about that. But that's a breathless rush through the argument about meaning being a normative concept, the argument that it's a criterion of adequacy of specifying what we're doing in using expressions, that we can say how that underwrites the applicability of normative vocabulary. There is, of course, an anti-normativist backlash to that. Hathiangadi, Wigforss, Gluer are maybe principal standard bearers of an anti-normativism about meaning. I put in the available reading a paper by Wolf Lobel responding to them. And if you're interested in following up this issue, he gives you references to, I think, all three of Hathiangadi, Gluer, and Wigforss. Basically, they're, and so I'm just going to breathlessly go through this debate, mention this debate, because you can look at it in more detail in Lobel's published treatment of it. They say, look, it can't be that what it is for me to be playing chess, it can be that what it is for me to be playing chess is for me to be following the rules of chess, according with the norms of chess. If I start moving things around in ways that are not appropriate according to the norms that define the game of chess, then I'm not playing chess, I'm doing something else. But meaning something can't be like that. Otherwise, when I misuse an expression, the correct description would be I'm not misusing that expression, I'm just using another one. I'm attaching a different meaning to it. If what I mean is determined by the norms I follow, then I could use different norms than other people do, but I couldn't ever violate the norm. Whatever I do would be in accord with what I mean. I could just have odd meanings. And yet that's not how the notion of meaning works. So their claim was there's got to be some notion of meaning something that's has distance between it and actually following a particular rule, because we've got to underwrite the notion of mistakes. And the response that you'll see Wolf making is, well, yes, indeed, you need to distinguish between, in effect, the context of deliberation, what do I think the norm is, and the context of assessment, the first person and the second or third person. It's one thing to be bound by a norm. It's another to follow, to do what you are supposed to do according to that norm. We need a richer picture of the normative environment. It's not just a matter of one individual. We've got to think about assessments of what they're doing by other people. So as a speaker of English, I'm bound by the norms that govern the use of the term aluminum or copper. I am in effect, when I say the coin in my pocket is copper, or even just wonder whether the coin in my pocket is copper, I'm in effect playing a counter in a public game, undertaking a commitment, and it's not up to me what follows from that. I may have very little idea, but people will assess whether what I said was correct, appealing to the norm that I bound myself by playing that counter in the game, Metallurgists who know a lot more will say, well, what he said is true only if the coin would melt at 1,084 degrees C. Well, I didn't know I was committing myself to that, but in fact, I was. And it's only if we think about what we're doing that way that we see how we can do what we mostly do speaking, which is talking without knowing what the hell we're talking about. I can wonder whether something is molybdenum, knowing, and I'm genuinely having molybdenum thoughts because as an English speaker, I can play that counter in the game and bind myself by whatever the norms for the use of molybdenum are, which run far beyond what I realize. So the claim is the anti-normativists are using much too impoverished a notion of normative practice. They need a notion of binding yourself by a norm that is distinct from following the norm in the sense of acting correctly according to it. And I hope I'll remember to, at the end today, to mention that that's a distinction that's already in Kant. You're a rational being in the sense of having the dignity and the rights that go with that, if you're subject to assessment according to the reasons for what you do and what you say. How good you are at actually acting for reasons, that's an evaluative matter that's more or less between people. Being a rational being is being bound by the norms of reason. And that swings to a large extent free from how good you are at actually following those considerations. I will mention, in the same spirit in which I mentioned Kripke's Harvard career, that the global paper that was published at the time, though the version you have isn't a PDF of the publication, that was the first term paper he ever wrote as a Pitt student in one of my classes anyway, that I considered a devastating refutation of the anti-normativists. Okay, the next piece of conceptual machinery that I want to put on the table is Hugh Price's distinction between object naturalism and subject naturalism. What he calls object naturalists, the paradigm here would be his Australian compatriot Frank Jackson. Locus classicus is his Oxford Locke lectures. Anyway, Jackson, who says, look, I'm a naturalist. I believe that what there is what the natural scientists tell us there is. And if you philosophers are talking about something, about beauty, about goodness, whatever it is, I want to know what part of the world, as the natural scientists tell us it is, you're talking about. I want to know how to place the objects and properties that you're talking about in that world. And Price calls that object naturalism. When we're talking, what are we talking about? What objects are we representing as they're being in the world? What properties are we attributing to them? The challenge for the object naturalist is to give a naturalistic specification of those objects, properties, and relations. But Price says that's not the only way to be a naturalist about language. You can also be a naturalist about what you're doing in using the language. You can be a naturalist about the practices of talking this way. And you can be a naturalist about practices of talking in a way that do not admit a representational semantics. So you would say, well, in talking this way, you can understand perfectly well how people talk this way. For instance, Jackson has got a placement problem with natural numbers. Where is the number 3 in the physicist's world? Well, it's in her notebook. She uses arithmetic all the time. Yeah, but where in the world is the number 3 that her inscription refers to? And here, the later Wittgenstein, when confronted with this, says, look, let me tell you about the number 3. We teach kids how to count, and then we teach them how to add. And if you understand those practices, you understand everything you need to understand about the use of this numeral. There's nothing mysterious about learning to use the numeral 3. If you're puzzled then about what it refers to, what in the world it represents, maybe that's a problem of you're having a bad semantics, one that insists that for every expression that you know how to use, that there has to be something in the world that corresponds to it. Price reads the later Wittgenstein as giving us, in a broad sense of naturalist, subject naturalist accounts of all sorts of mysterious, of otherwise mysterious forms of talk. Oh, you wonder what pains are. Wittgenstein says, well, look, let me tell you how we use pain talk. If there's nothing mysterious about that, then any puzzlements you have left over about what pains are a result of your having a bad, too restrictive representationalist metaphysics. So this is a paradigm for Wittgenstein of a metaphysical puzzlement. You say, oh, I learned how to talk about gold being in my teeth. There was a time when there wasn't gold in my teeth, and then the dentist put gold in my teeth. The gold was somewhere before it was in my teeth. Now I extend that way of talking to saying I have pain in my teeth. Yes, but where was the pain before it was in my teeth? Well, if you're puzzled about that, that's a kind of placement problem. Wittgenstein says, you shouldn't be, because pain talk is not mysterious. We can explain how we learn to talk this way in a broadly naturalistic sense. This is how we teach the young ones to talk. This is what we've caught on to. We can see how the physical in talk, containment talk, how we could learn to extend that to pains, but the analogy wasn't perfect. Some things that you could say in the old, some questions that made sense in the old usage don't make sense in the new one. Nothing mysterious about that. Price says, by all means, be naturalists, but be subject naturalists about the language. Be naturalists about the practices of using the expression. That's what Wittgenstein teaches us. Okay, I'm going to have more to say about that in a minute, because I think that's an absolutely crucial distinction. Basically, I read Price as saying one way to demystify a form of words is to give a pragmatic characterization of it, a characterization of it in a pragmatic metavocabulary. Say what you have to be doing in order to be talking this way. You don't have to give an account of the meaning in a representational semantic metavocabulary in order to demystify the practice. And I want to say, yes, and you can demystify it without its being a naturalistic pragmatic metavocabulary. It could be an irreducibly normative one. But to say that, let me try and be a little bit more careful about what pragmatic metavocabularies are. And this is now, instead of rehearsing material from making it explicit, I'm rehearsing material from the later between saying and doing, my Locke lectures, my Oxford Locke lectures. And this is what the handsome picture in your handout is. Let me send this around in case somebody came in later. Here the idea is you've got a base vocabulary, typically ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. And we've got the practices that are the use of that vocabulary. Quine is saying it's the practices of using the expression that are all there could be to confer content on it, to make it mean what it means. And that's the Kripkensteinian presupposition as well. So at the bottom of that triangle, you see, at the bottom left, you see a set of discursive practices. Here, I suppose I should, I'm going to talk about this. You can see that, right? So we've got discursive practices that I say are PV sufficient for deploying the base vocabulary. The P is for the practices, the V is for the vocabulary. If you engage in those practices, you will be using those expressions. You'll be using those expressions with the meanings that they have in the base vocabulary. A pragmatic metavocabulary, then, at the top of that diagram, specifies the discursive practices. It's VP sufficient. It's a vocabulary that's sufficient to specify the practices, that's the V and the P, such that if what you say in the pragmatic metavocabulary about the discursive practices is true, anytime that's true, then engaging in those practices will be PV sufficient to make the base vocabulary mean what it means. So the pragmatic metavocabulary lets you say necessary and sufficient conditions for engaging in these discursive practices, which, as a matter of fact, if you're engaging in those practices, the ones specified by the pragmatic metavocabulary, are sufficient to confer the contents of the base vocabulary, to determine that you're using the base vocabulary to mean what it actually means. And if that's so, then the relation between those two vocabularies, the dotted line then, which is the composition of the two other relations, that's the relation between a pragmatic metavocabulary and a base vocabulary. So I have in mind a diagram like that when I say the VP sufficient pragmatic metavocabulary must say how it's correct to use expressions when it's specifying the practices, if those practices are then to be PV sufficient to confer the meanings of the base vocabulary. So that's an attempt to unpack the notion of pragmatic metavocabularies, dissect the relation that's the dotted line into two more basic relations. Parenthetically, what I do in the rest of between saying and doing is use these notions of VP sufficiency and PV sufficiency to build up other pragmatically mediated semantic relations between vocabularies. This is the simplest semantic relation, being a pragmatic metavocabulary for a base vocabulary. That's a semantic relation between the vocabularies, but it's mediated by the discursive practices in it. And it turns out that there are lots of other important pragmatically mediated semantic relations between vocabularies. There are questions or comments about that? Unpacking? I say the first chapter between saying and doing is where I try and explain this in more detail. But if you think about the mandala of metavocabularies of reason, you can think about the pragmatics as having this, the triangle in the lower left of that, as having this fine structure. We'll next week be sort of adding structure to this. But yeah, Hassan.
Yeah, my question is about actually a little further back, the sort of regress that Regularism faces and the result that we need sort of implicit practices. I don't totally understand the dialectic. I think my problem is wondering, so it seems to me that the reason the Regulus sort of gives this explanation in the first place is to, say, what it is for me to understand what I'm doing. I need to use concepts, but then the problem is, like, to understand how those concepts need to be correctly applied, I need more concepts. And so I guess I don't understand how it's the explicitness or the implicitness that creates or avoids the problem. It seems to me it's like the application. I don't totally get, like, how do the practices help solve the initial worry, or help deal with the initial worry of, like, how do I understand what I'm doing using concepts or whatever?
Okay, good. I haven't said anything that is responsive
Okay.
to that. I mean, you're quite right that it seems like immediately we should say, well, okay, so I could only follow this rule if I have a whole bunch of concepts. So maybe there's some holist issue here that, on certain ways of thinking about the holism might get you into regress problems when others maybe not. But that holism, well, maybe the same thing is going to be true about the implicit practices. In order to know how to do this, I need to know how to do many of these other things. Nobody who's concerned about naturalism is going to be happy with the light dawns slowly over the whole. That's a Wittgensteinian gesture in this direction. And I haven't said anything that responds to that. One is going to need to tell a holistic story. The invocation of the implicitness, I think, comes up in the regulist, in the context of the regulist horn of the dilemma, because we say, well, any norm that's implicit, that's explicit in the form of a rule or a principle, is going to determine a line between correct and incorrect for novel cases only against the background of practices of applying it. And it can be applied correctly or incorrectly. And so there's going to be a norm that we have to worry about that's being invoked by this regulist, rule-based response. And then we have the same dilemma there. that norm for correctly applying the rule. If that's explicit in another rule, we've got to regress. If it's implicit in a practice, what does that mean? But it invites a picture of norms that are explicit in the form of rules, which determine what's correct by saying what's correct, makes sense only if we think of them as floating on a sea of implicitly normative practices of applying the concepts that are appealed to in the rules correctly or incorrectly. But that doesn't take us very far to understanding that sea of implicitly normative performances. Fair enough.
So is the idea that, like, sort of originally in practices, the norms aren't sort of, I guess, conceptually articulated explicit. They're just sort of, they don't, no one's given voice to them or anything.
That's what I think, that one has to think of the norms as bottoming out in non-conceptual abilities. And so I think that we have to make sense of a notion of normativity that is intelligible for creatures who can't speak yet, and so can't apply concepts. Here I'm helping myself to the Salesian slogan that grasp of a concept is mastery of the use of a word. But yes, that's the view, that a practice, the way I would use it, involves performances and implicit norms. And so that involves the practitioners assessing each other's performances as correct or incorrect. And in practice, treating them or taking or treating them in practice as correct or incorrect. I mean, my intentionally reductive and sort of ridiculous image in chapter 1 of Making It Explicit is they beat each other with sticks to say that some performance is inappropriate. And we can make sense of them shaping each other's behavior so that, for instance, in the example, one's only allowed to enter the special hut if you show a leaf from the distant tree, because Ugg and Og, who stand on the door, will beat you with sticks if you try and go in without that license. And in doing that, they they institute the significance of a license or a ticket on that leaf by treating as inappropriate. Now, there's a lot to be said about how to get from there to anything recognizable as genuine normativity, but I say some things about that in the chapter there. Okay, well, maybe that's a good place for us to take our break. When we come back, I'll talk about the expressive power of two-dimensional pragmatic metavocabularies. So I have that it's 2:19. Why don't we come back at 2:34? We all have machines. We should be able to do that. Welcome back, everybody. I want to say something briefly about the shape of the normative metavocabulary that I think we need to attribute to it in order for it to do the expressive job that it needs to do, namely to describe at least sufficient conditions for conferring on expressions used as specified in the pragmatic metavocabulary propositional contents. That's the goal. And this is a distinction that people have not, the distinction I want to talk about is one that people have not appreciated. There isn't a big discussion about it, but I think is absolutely crucial. And that is whether our normative vocabulary is one-dimensional or two-dimensional. One-dimensional, merely binary, as I'll say, is if we think about the vocabulary we use to describe performances, thinking according to the implicit norms of some practice, a binary is it a binary normative concept? Is it correct or incorrect? Is it appropriate or inappropriate? Is it the right way to do things or the wrong way to do things, a good way, a bad way? To pick versions of this that people have actually used for pragmatic metavocabularies, is it verified or not verified, or falsified or not falsified? Is it inbounds or out of bounds, the position you've gotten yourself into? If you looked at the Restall from the suggested readings, the bilateralism he's putting forward there is something we'll talk a lot more about next week. But that's the binary that he and Dave Ripley use, inbounds or out of bounds. Or the one that has the most history is assertable or non-assertable. So for instance, Dewey, Sellers, Dummett, and at least Kripke's Wittgenstein all want to use assertability as the key normative concept in their vocabularies. And all of them are thinking of it as doing on the pragmatic side the same sort of work that the notion of truth was to do on the semantic side. Dewey is quite explicit. He wants us to talk in terms of assertability rather than truth. Sellers, similarly, this is at the core of Dummett's intuitionism-based anti-realist philosophy of language. And the point I want to focus on here is this is just one binary opposition. There's really only one normative concept in play here. Is this assertable or not assertable? And I'm going to claim that one needs, in order to make sense of assertion and in particular its relation to reasons, which I claim is internal to the notion, you need at least two flavors of deontic status. You need a notion of authority and a notion of responsibility, or a notion of commitment and a notion of entitlement, each of which you can think of as binaries, but they're orthogonal to each other. One can be committed without being entitled, entitled without being committed, committed and entitled, or neither committed nor entitled, as we'll see. And the expressive power that you get by using a two-sorted deontic, normative, pragmatic metavocabulary is tremendous. The difference between 1 and 2 here is huge. Now, at the end of the day, one might want to ask, well, then wouldn't you get a similar expressive bonanza if you went to a three-sorted deontic, normative metavocabulary? Maybe so. I don't know how to do that, and haven't walked down that road. Now, in ordinary deontic logic, we have a pseudo two-dimensional halfway house. So traditional deontic logic uses two operators analogous to possibility and necessity, permissible and obligatory. And so you might say, okay, the logic of permission and obligation That sounds like it's genuinely two-sorted, like it's two-dimensional. But from my point of view, this is a fake halfway house because deontic logics endorse the definition of one of these in terms of the other. That is, in deontic logic, you define X is permissible as X is you define permissible X as not obligatory not X, or you define obligatory X as not permissible not X. So these are interdefinable. And I think that makes two mistakes, at least in the present context. But it's normally people in meta-ethics who are thinking about deontic logic, and I would urge them to use a more flexible deontic metavocabulary than they are using. But at least when we're talking about discursive practices, I think the strategy goes wrong twice. And one is it squeezes out possible regions of deontic space. Maybe what one is permitted to do is a subset, only a proper subset of the things that one is not obliged not to do. One might be not obliged not to do a whole lot of things, only some of which one was permitted to do. So you're at least strongly undertaking a serious commitment as to the shape of deontic space if you endorse one of these definitions. And some of the regions you're squeezing out claims you are not committed to the negation of that you're not committed to the negation of it does not mean you're entitled to it. That region of space is important here. The second place it goes wrong, I think, is this is appealing to the logical notion of negation at the wrong place. We're going to use commitment and entitlement to define incompatibility, and then incompatibility to define what's expressed by negation. Negation should come in, logic should come in at the end of the story, not at the very beginning of the story. At any rate, those are sort of weak arguments against or considerations that speak against this way of doing things. But mainly, I want to claim, and I'll hope to show you, that you get a bonanza of expressive power if you have genuinely two-dimensional, not interdefinable normative notions here. And this is, one of the key conceptual moves of making it explicit is moving to this two-sorted normative vocabulary. So that's just something to watch out for, but I wanted to underline that as a major lesson I think I've learned, or anyway, an important move that's available. But let me apply that. Let me show some of the expressive power that you get for that by talking about assertion. And here, having convinced myself that assertion was maybe the most important speech act many years ago, I looked to speech act theory. Okay, tell me about this speech act. And Austin is not systematic. It's not one of the topics he's particularly interested in. Very hard to extract an account from him. His student Searle, more explicit in his book Speech Acts. And indeed, he starts off with the notion of assertion. But what he says is an assertion that P is an undertaking to the effect that P. And I found this desperately disappointing and unhelpful. What effect is that? What is the effect that things are thus and so for some value there? So I thought, well, that isn't advancing the story. Much later, Tim Williamson says an assertion is a claim to knowledge, and he gets a lot of mileage out of that. And I want to say there's something importantly right about that, but he's only gone one level deep. If you look at how the considerations that connect assertion and knowledge really work, you wouldn't say just that assertion was a claim to knowledge. That's true, but there's a level deeper of analysis that we can give. Now, what I want from the notion of assertion is two things. First of all, I want to use it to demarcate genuinely discursive practices, to draw the line around linguistic practices. I want to say that something is a linguistic practice, at least in the full-blooded sense, if and only if it accords to some performances the pragmatic significance of assertions, of claims, that things are thus and so. And second, I'll claim that the notion of assertion and the notion of reasons are indissolubly bound to one another. They're reciprocally sense-dependent in that you can't understand what reasons are unless you understand what claims are. Claims are the premises and conclusions of reason relations. And you can't understand what reasons are without understanding, what claims are, what assertions are. So on that first front, Wittgenstein famously said that language doesn't have a downtown. It's all suburbs haphazardly connected to one another. And I'm just disagreeing with that. I'm saying, in the important sense, language does have a downtown. And it's the game of giving and asking for reasons, where what can serve as a reason and stand in need of a reason is an assertion. The downtown of specifically language games is practices of making claims and defending and challenging them by giving reasons for them or against them. That's the picture we should have. Anything else is a fragment. His little Sprachspiele aren't, strictly speaking, linguistic games. They're fragments of them. Fine for the work he needs to do with them. And this is the idea that languages are at base systems of social practices that make it possible to say something, to say how things are. The contents that you assert are propositions. And the expressions whose utterance has the default significance of an assertion are declarative sentences. So I sometimes call this the iron triangle of discursiveness. On the pragmatic side, it's the speech act of assertion. That's the doing. On the semantic side, what's asserted, assertable contents, are propositional contents, that things are thus and so. And what corresponds on the syntactic side to assertions of propositional contents is declarative sentences. Those three go together pragmatic, semantic, and syntactic expressions of discursiveness, which is saying something in the sense of making it explicit. That's the fundamental notion. And my suggestion is that we enter that iron triangle of discursiveness from the pragmatic side, from thinking about the speech act of assertion. Now, let me quickly mention two sources of friction, directions of pushback that people have offered. Some people object to this assertionalism, to this privileging of assertion over other speech acts. I think there's a way in which that's well taken and a way in which it's not. I think it's not well taken if the idea is something else should be thought of as the fundamental speech act. So, for instance, Sellers' Pittsburgh student Chris Gauker wrote a book arguing that imperatives, orders, could be treated as the basic speech act. And I think this is not right. You can't have something that means shut the door if there isn't something that means the door is shut. So how would you know whether it had been done or not? Where I think it is well taken is the suggestion that assertion comes along with a lot of other things. So my colleague Noel Belknap argues that any practice that has assertions in it is going to have questions in it. You can't have questions without assertions because we understand questions in terms of what are responsive answers to them, and the answers are assertions. But he's saying questions are going to be part of the practice. Could be. I don't have a problem with that. The most sophisticated pushback along saying, look, there's a whole package that assertion is part of, are Proud Pit Products, Quill Kukla and Mark Lance, in their book Yo and Low, give the state-of-the-art argument for a position that there's a whole package of speech acts that come together, assertion being a core one of those, but the others coming along with it. I regard that as an entirely friendly amendment. No doubt they're right. Another source of resistance that in the end, I both acknowledge but don't feel threatens this enterprise is that this is setting the bar too high, that requiring for language use, concept use, for reasons to be in play, a full-blooded assertional practice distracts us from halfway houses that are important. I'm an extravagant admirer of the work of Michael Tomasello, the great developmental psychologist who works with both human children and chimpanzees and has taught us so much by the comparisons of them. We got to know each other years ago in Leipzig, and a bit later when it was convenient for him to come to Pittsburgh, he came as my guest as a visiting scholar in the philosophy department. And for that academic year, every week we talked for a couple hours about reasons, language, sociality. He'd already read Making It Explicit, and I was working through his work, including the book he was writing at the time. He's argued on the basis of a mass of empirical evidence that what sets human children apart from other primates, what sets them on the road to language, is not intelligence, but sociality, and in particular, the kind of normativity that goes with being the kind of social beings that we are and that no other primate is. And he thinks that by focusing on the very high end, the full-blown assertional practices, I obscure the kind of acknowledgement of norms that amount to reasons or reason, proto-reasons, something like that, in pre-linguistic but genuinely social practices. Again, I think he's probably right in everything he says. That's a friendly amendment. Don't ignore the stuff that comes before. I still want to insist it's worth drawing a bright line around assertion. And that you should think of, to pick up the earlier point, in a deontically fully two-dimensional setting, not a merely one-dimensional binary setting. And we can think about that in two different ways, in terms of authority and responsibility, or in terms of commitment and entitlement. And actually these different ways will intertwine. Some things are better said in the one way, some things better said in the other way. In terms of authority and responsibility, this is the way I did it in my original treatment in an essay called Asserting. The point of assertion is to exercise a certain kind of authority, to make available my claim to you for you to use ultimately as a premise in your own reasoning on my authority. But that notion of assertion as an exercise of authority, licensing you to inter alia reassert it, but to reason from it, depends on a correlative relation, on a correlative status of responsibility. After all, I'm passing on a license to you, which you apparently need. Why do you need that license? Well, because there's an implicit responsibility when you claim something that you can vindicate your entitlement to that commitment, that you can give reasons for it, that you can justify it. And what I'm doing when I assert the claim is licensing my audience to reassert it, to use it in their own reasoning. And if they're challenged to back it up and show they're entitled to it, instead of them having to give reasons for it, they can invoke my testimonial authority. Say, well, go ask Bob. I heard it from him. And then they will only count as entitled to it if, in fact, I counted as entitled to it. The challenge comes over to me. And now eventually somebody has to do something other than testimonially defer. They have to actually give a justification for it. They have to give reasons for it. So the notion of testimonial authority as essential to the speech act of assertion only makes sense in the context where there's a standing justificatory responsibility, may be triggered only by appropriate challenges, that is, by challenges that are also authorized, that one is authorized to make, or we can think of the assertion as expressing a commitment whose entitlement is always potentially at issue. Someone can give a reason against that commitment, and now I have to defend my commitment, vindicate my entitlement to that commitment by giving a reason for it, on pain of my authority to others, which is a matter of my entitling my audience to make the claim, but they can only inherit my entitlement if I have it. If I can't vindicate my entitlement when suitably challenged, then I don't have any authority. I don't have any entitlement to my commitment, which my audience could inherit. So making claims is part of a practice of challenging them with reasons against them and defending them with reasons for them. The testimonial structure of acquiring entitlement from another person is part of a package that includes the justificatory vindication of entitlement by giving reasons for the claim. All these are aspects of a practice that come together. And this practice, let me say something about what I think one learns from thinking about saying something in this sense of saying something, asserting something. What using this two-sorted deontic vocabulary of commitment and entitlement. Undertaking a commitment is a kind of responsibility. Entitlement is a kind of authority. So, these two ways of talking really line up. It's just in the vernacular, sometimes it is smoother to talk in the one terms or in the other terms, but it's really one distinction of two kinds of deontic status. And in these terms, it's natural to think of the notion of entitlement, which can be acquired in two different ways, right? You can acquire entitlement by a justificatory practice, by giving reasons for it, or you can acquire it testimonially by appeal to someone else's assertion. Those two naturally go together. Naturally go together. They're really only intelligible as practices, as features of one practice, which has what I call the default and challenge structure of entitlement. That is basically the mere fact that somebody makes a claim gives it a certain default entitlement. Their license to other people to reassert it is in force in the eyes of somebody who's keeping track, some scorekeeper, by default, until and unless somebody challenges it, raises a reason against it, makes an objection to it. Some people can disqualify themselves on a whole topic, and we say, oh, don't listen to anything they say, but that should be done because they have failed to respond to challenges in this area before. And this default and challenge structure, where we say, well, the authority, the license of an assertion is something it gets by default, just because somebody committed themselves to it, is by itself a default reason anyway to accept it, not uncritically, but the criticism is considering objections to it. But it's a fragile and defeasible form of authority. If a reason is given against it, then they've got to respond to that on pain of losing the authority, losing that default entitlement that the thing had. Here's one epistemological lesson that the default and challenge structure that sees testimonial inheritance of entitlement and justificatory conferral of entitlement or inheritance of entitlement as two sides of one coin, two aspects of one practice. Here's an epistemological lesson that we learned from that. Traditional epistemology begins with the Agrippin trilemma. which forces a choice between skepticism and foundationalism, and so an oscillation between them. It says, if to say that to be entitled to a claim, you have to be able to justify it, then either, first part of the trilemma, when we ask, well, what's the, so I say that P, and you say, what's your justification for that? I say that Q, you say, well, what's your justification for that? Either the chain of justifying premises doesn't end, you just go on and on, there's an infinite regress, and you never get to a claim that you're entitled to, whose entitlement can be inherited through this chain of reasons. Infinite regress, conclusion, you don't really have any entitlement here. Or eventually you come around in a circle to something that you'd already appealed to higher up. And again, there's no inheritance to be entitlement to be inherited there. Again, skepticism. Or when one traces back down this chain of justification, you get to something that you just are entitled to, an unjustified justifier, a foundational claim, something that is justified without having to be justified. And that's the foundation of epistemology. So this Agrippin trilemma says, look, if there's an infinite regress of justification or a circle, then you should be a skeptic and say, well, then we're never entitled to anything. Or there's a foundation, and now we should think about what that foundation is. But notice how the default and challenge structure evades that trilemma, because it says there are multiple sources of entitlement. Entitlement by justifying is only one of them. There's a default entitlement, which is defeasible, to be sure, but you start off with an entitlement until somebody makes a challenge, a reason against it. But that's another assertion whose entitlement can be at issue. We should distinguish, the thought is, justificatory status, entitlement or not entitlement, that boundary, that binary, from the process of justifying. And if we admit that there are other ways of acquiring the status of entitlement or being justified, other than the process of justifying by reasons, then we're not stuck in the Agrippin trilemma. And this is basically what the Wittgensteinian response to, downstream from Wittgenstein, response to skepticism is that we really only need to defend ourselves against challenges that the challenger is entitled to, in the same sense that our entitlement is at issue, and we have to treat some claims as having default entitlement. Testimony is a crucial non-evidential form of entitlement inheritance, and it's of the essence of the notion of default entitlement. So on this picture, there's interpersonal inheritance of entitlement by testimony of the same content. So it's interpersonal, but intra-content, that's testimony. And then there's intrapersonal, but inter-content inheritance of entitlement, where one thing's a reason for another, implies it or has it as a consequence. You can't give P as a reason for P. You have to give Q as a reason for P, some different content, different assertion. But that's within one person. I'm justifying myself by giving that claim. And there's a non-trivial epistemology built into this. Well, I've said something about how a response to skepticism that wasn't available on Agrippan presuppositions becomes available in the context of a default and challenge structure of entitlement, assertion, and reasons. You get an account of what it is to take someone to know something. And this is what I want to say is right about Williamson's line, but now I'm going to claim we know something further than we get just from the claim that to assert something is to claim to know it. Traditional analysis of knowledge is as justified true belief. And that's right as far as it goes. I'm not going to worry about the Gettier cases that argue that a fourth condition is needed. In this normative context, to take somebody to know something is to attribute a commitment to them. That's what corresponds to the belief condition. It's to attribute entitlement to that belief, to that commitment. And that's what corresponds to the justification condition, though we saw justification as a status, which is related only in more complicated ways to justifying as an activity, but having positive justificatory status, that's being entitled. So in attributing knowledge to someone, one's attributing a commitment, attributing entitlement. Well, and then there's that third condition, which is taking it to be true. And on this account, what that consists in is not attributing some property or status to it. Taking it to be true is acknowledging the commitment yourself, undertaking that commitment yourself. That's what taking it to be true is. Knowledge is a hybrid normative status that we can only understand in terms of attributing commitment, attributing entitlement, and undertaking commitment yourself. Knowledge essentially comes up only in this social context. And it is, insofar as it's a normative status at all, it's a hybrid normative status. This sort of analysis of what it is to take somebody to know something is giving a pragmatic analysis of it. It's saying what you need to do to be attributing knowledge to somebody, rather than saying in sort of object naturalist terms, saying in a semantic metavocabulary, what has to be true of somebody for them to know. Say, look, I'll tell you about truth talk. There's nothing hidden or mysterious about it. If you understand commitments and entitlements, you should take somebody to know something. If you take them to be committed, take them to be entitled, and if you yourself are committed to that claim, that's the secret of truth talk. And that's what a subject naturalist rather than an object naturalist would want to do. Of course, I haven't used a naturalistic pragmatic metavocabulary to do that. I've used a normative pragmatic metavocabulary to explain what you're doing when you talk about knowledge, when you take somebody to know something. And this is something that can only come up if you're the interpreter of the assertions of other people. In your own case, the belief condition and the truth condition would collapse. It's only in the social context that you can think about that. So here's a picture of how people have to, what practical attitudes people have to adopt to one another. And I like the notion of a practical attitude in aeronautic terminology. The attitude of an airplane is the angle, vertical or horizontal, that it has. That's not a conceptual matter. That the attitude it adopts is sort of the way it's going through the world, the trajectory that it's taking. And I want to know, how do people practically have to take or treat each other, respond to each other for those practices, those practical attitudes, collectively to institute the pragmatic significance of an assertion. And the claim is, well, it's an assertion if you take it that somebody's undertaking a commitment whose entitlement is potentially at issue. They get a sort of fragile on loan entitlement just for making it. That's the default part of the structure of entitlement. But it's fragile because it's subject to challenge by somebody making an incompatible commitment, which will serve as a reason against it. But you can revive it by giving a reason for it, that is, making another assertion that stands to it in the reason relation of implication. The two reason relations, implication normatively governs reasons for, and incompatibility normatively governs reasons against. Reasons against are pragmatic challenges, reasons for are pragmatic defenses of the claim. And if I take you to be entitled to your commitment, then I take your assertion of it to have authority that is entitlement, that's inheritable by other people who, if they're challenged, can defer testimonially to you. They don't have to give a reason for their claim to defend it. They can testimonially defer to you. And if you can defend it, they inherit the entitlement from that. So that's the structure, on the one hand, of assertion, and on the other hand, of a game of giving and asking for reasons. Making claims and challenging and defending them, they're all part of the one practice. Yeah, Thomas.
So one thing, there's, some, at least a superficial similarity between, the base entitlement that comes with, on this view, just making an assertion, and the base entitlement that perceptual conservatists attribute to someone by merely having a perceptual experience. You have a perceptual experience, you're defeasibly entitled to whatever the content that experience has, depending on how you view that. And I think part of the motivation there is that experience is passive, it's a taking in, it's not something over which you have necessarily direct control, and you're justified in taking things how they appear to you to be, other things being equal. But I'm having, what is really the motivation for attributing the base entitlement to someone on the mere basis of an assertion, other than finding a way to avoid the Agrippin trilemma? Like, what is it about asserting that entitles someone merely by asserting to what they assert?
Okay, a good question. And I mean, what is it in this picture in the perceptual case? That is, there's some perceptual abilities that we sort of expect everybody to have. You can tell whether the light is red or green. Well, on the other hand, 10% of us males are red-green colorblind. You can't be sure about this. And experts can look at the pot shard and tell you whether it's Aztec or Toltec, and I can't do that. But they have this perceptual ability. For ordinary perceptual things, the kinds where we take, where we're willing to grant everybody the sort of default entitlement. Well, how do you know it's raining out? Well, she said it was raining out. You can tell whether it's raining out. What you're really doing is endorsing a reliability inference. That is, I'm taking it that the fact that Tomas says this is a reason for me to endorse it. It is a sufficient reason for me to endorse it. Talking about rain, talking about red things, I don't know whether you're a reliable reporter of Toltec pot shards or not. Probably not. Unless I have some particular reason, I'm not going to attribute reliability in that way. Now, notice what I'm saying. Endorsing this reliability inference is something I can specify in this normative pragmatic metavocabulary. It's the endorsement from your saying it to my taking it to be true, my endorsing it. Your commitment gives me a reason that I take to be entitling to me. Now, if you thought that it's too wishy-washy to just treat people as generally reliable, lots of people just talk to make noise and they're not being critical about what they say at all. Well, we say, if they're really not critical about it at all, Darwin's going to take care of them, I think. But in any claim where the entitlement could really be at issue, we can have ranges of reliability that we practically attribute to them. And all I need is that there's enough of that, look, there's a whole bunch of claims that sort of everybody's entitled to, and boy, you would have to go way out of your way to get a viable challenge to. There have been black dogs, cats are mammals, freedom is better than slavery, sticking a pin through your hand will hurt. There's a whole lot of things that we just, okay, you count as entitled to that, unless somebody's got a special reason. And then there are these broadly perceptual things, reports of non-inferential reports, or easy inferences that they've made. You don't need to claim that the mere assertion without anything else is a default entitlement. You can think instead of these overlapping ranges of practically taking or treating people to be reliable. In Anna Wierzbicka's wonderful, she's a linguist, Australian linguist, wonderful book on the English language, she talks about the spread along with the English language of this distinctive view of Locke's, that where he says that it's a measure of the stature of a person, that they apportion their affirmations to their evidence. Saying, look, to be taken seriously, you should show that you're judicious in apportioning your affirmation, your assent to your evidence. And the claim is this was actually quite a peculiar cultural practice, and it was spread through textbooks and so on. We can well imagine these practices as being embedded in practices where people say things that aren't, in the sense I'm picking out, assertions. They're saying it because they like the sound of it or whatever, but are not actually acknowledging any responsibility to be entitled to say it. I'm claiming that this needs to be part of a practice that does involve that, because this is what confers propositional content on the claimables. The propositional content is a matter of the role they play as reasons for other things, reasons for it or against it, and as things that other claimables can be reasons for and against. Those are the reason relations that are at the core of the course and I claim of the discursive practice. So, repeating myself, the two big claims that I wanted, at least to show how the world could look like, these were true through this model of assertion, is that the notion of assertion and the notion of reasons go hand in hand. That the testimonial authority of assertion essentially depends on there being some non-testimonial way of acquiring positive justificatory status, namely by giving reasons for in response to reasons against, so that assertional practices so considered essentially involve relations of being a reason for and against, the reason relations that we'll see we can use to understand propositional content. And then second, that this is a sensible thing to mean by language or by discursive practice, is a practice that whatever else it does allows people, confers on some performances the significance of assertions, of claimables. Okay, there's a lot in this vicinity that I'm not talking about, but next time we're going to see a particular way of implementing this sort of general view, and I've sort of pointed you to where they are in the notes. You'll see there's some other things. Before we close, let me give this lagnape, this additional but optional sort of story, and say, and this story I've told is a Kantian story. I mean, I said last time that I think of Kant's axial insight, the one around which all of his work revolves, as the insight that what distinguishes judgings and intentional doings from the responses of merely natural creatures is that they're things we're in a distinctive sense responsible for. They're commitments of ours. That this leads him to the primacy of the propositional, to saying, look, the judgment is the smallest unit of awareness in the sense of sapience, or his term is apperception, because it's the smallest unit you can take responsibility for. This is why we have to understand concepts after we understand judgments as functions of judgment. They're rules that determine what we've made ourselves responsible for. When I call something, when I say the coin is copper, I've committed myself, invested my authority in that. What I've made myself responsible for in terms of what are reasons for and against it, that's determined by the content of the concept. The subjective form of judgment, Kant says, is the I think, that is the emptiest of all representations because it can accompany any of them. That's the formal mark of who's taking responsibility for it, associated with the transcendental unity of apperception that I'll talk about in a minute. The objective form of judgment he says. Subjective is the I think. Who's responsible? The objective form of judgment, he says, is the object equals X. That's a matter of what we're talking about, what we've made ourselves responsible to in making the judgment. The object that's represented, this is the basis of Kant's normative version, normative transposition, or his transposition into a normative vocabulary of the representation relation, thinking of what's represented, the object equals X, what you're talking or thinking about in normative terms as what's authoritative over the correctness of your judgment. What's represented is what determines, what sets the normative standard for assessments of correctness of your judgment as a representing of that represented. Playing that normative role is what it is to be represented, and having something that serves as that kind of normative standard is what it is for your judging to be a representing. So that's all packed into the notion of the objective form of a judgment. Kant thinks of what I called last time the basic Kantian normative status is a commitment whose entitlement is always at issue. It's a commitment that makes you liable to assessment as to the reasons you can give for it or against it. Here, here's a very quick story. At least after the Port Royal logic, the standard logical picture was to understand judging as predicating. That's why you started with concepts, particular and general concepts, and you predicated something general of something particular, or maybe something general of something less general. And then that sort of classification of kinds of judgment, kinds of predications, was the basis of a doctrine of syllogisms. But judgment was thought of as predication. But Kant saw that predication was being asked to do two different jobs there. On the one hand, it was constructing contents for us to endorse or not. And on the other hand, it was the theory of what endorsing was. That is, it had a role on the ing side, endorsing is predicating, but it also had a role on the ed side, building up what was endorsed. And this comes out if you think about logically compound sentences. He says, what are you predicating of what in a conditional, in a hypothetical judgment? If P, then Q. What have I predicated of what? Even if P and Q are predications, I can judge if P, then Q. How is that a predication? Or if that judgment is, if P of A, then Q of A, if A walks, then A moves. Well, I have not predicated, we ask, have I predicated at least P of A in saying that? Well, if I have, then predicating P of A is not judging, because I haven't judged that P of A. And if so, that's still not the predication in the whole conditional. So he saw that predication could be used for building up judgeable contents, but we needed a new notion of judging the activity. And his notion was that judging something is acknowledging the responsibility to integrate it into a constellation of commitments that has the unity distinctive of apperception. That is, what you're doing in judging is synthesizing this commitment with a constellation of other commitments in something exhibiting the synthetic unity of apperception. And that unity is a rational unity. In judging, you're undertaking the task responsibility to integrate, to synthesize it with your prior commitments by acknowledging incompatibilities and resolving them, by acknowledging consequences of the commitment that you've got, adding them to the constellation of commitments, and acknowledging the responsibility to have a justification for this, to have reasons for it. So you've got a critical task responsibility to extrude incompatible commitments from the constellation that has the unity of apperception. You have an ampliative responsibility to include consequences of it, and you have a justificatory responsibility to have reasons for any of the things in it. He's thinking about all of this because the question is, when you commit yourself in judgment, what would entitle you to that? What responsibility have you actually undertaken? And he gives a pragmatic account of that. He says, what you have committed yourself to do is to integrate it into this unity of apperception, to this constellation of commitments that has this rational unity. That's a picture that essentially depends on this two-dimensional normative structure of commitment and entitlement, articulated according to reasons. Now, Kant didn't have the social dimension. He wasn't thinking about testimony. He wasn't thinking about assertion. He wasn't thinking about social practices. He was doing it all inside one individual. And that made it harder for him to understand the normative statuses in various ways. That's where my hero Hegel comes in and helps him out, I think. But I'm hoping that with this very quick reminder of some of the general features of Kant's account, you can see the origins of the ideas that I've been describing transmuted into the philosophy of language. Dummett says in his mid-1970s giant, magnificent book on Frege's philosophy of language, transformative book, he says, I've argued throughout that rather than understanding assertion as the exteriorization of a prior interior act of judging, one should understand judging as the interiorization of a conceptually prior external act of asserting. That we can only understand the kind of taking responsibility internally that is judging in a Kantian sense if we start with an account of this social normative status that one is accorded when one makes an assertion, that is the pragmatic significance of an assertion in a discursive practice. And even though I've gone through this in a breathless way, well, all of it really, but particularly the Kant part at the end, I hope you can see that these ideas are there in Kant. Certainly the two-dimensional normative pragmatic metavocabulary as the account of judging, that's just Kant transmuted into this social practical idiom. I can't resist mentioning, though I won't be able to tell the story in the vicinity, that Michael Friedman, in his book on Kant and the exact sciences, which shows Kant as a brilliant philosopher of science, crippled by the fact that it was essentially 18th century science that he was a brilliant philosopher of, takes up an idea of Jaakko Hinteke's and runs with it about what synthesis is in Kant. And what I'm about to say is just meant to whet your appetite to go and look at that story of Friedman's, if you care about the Kant. And that is that Kant spent a full decade agonizing about the proof structure of Euclid's Elements. And what he saw in it was that whenever Euclid needed to prove existence or talk about infinity, he used constructions instead of reasoning that could be syllogistically recreated. He had to use diagrams for that. Paradigm is arguing that every line segment has a midpoint. You know how to do it. You draw circles around it and bisect it with a line you get from the intersection of the two circles. That's to show that there is a point. You have to do that construction. And that's the construction that shows you there's an infinite number of points in a line, because you can repeat that for the halves that you've gotten there. And so Kant thinks, well, there's what you can do with concepts. That's the part that Euclid could write down. And there's the part you can only do with your imagination, constructing things to make existential claims and claims about infinity. Well, when we look at that today, we think what he was seeing is that the conceptual machinery he had, syllogistic machinery, can't handle alternating iterated quantifiers. It in particular can't handle forms, claims of the form, for all there is. For every line segment, there is a midpoint. That's what you have to do to make these existential claims, and that's how you talk about infinity. He thought that he developed then a notion of synthesis as doing that bit of the conceptual labor that the conceptual side couldn't do. And Hintica's brilliant idea, which he doesn't make as much of as he should have, Friedman finally does, says, that is the power of iterated alternating quantifiers. If we just use the Skolem function version of those, then we get Kant's notion of synthesis. And the Skolem function notion of iterated quantifiers is wherever you would have a for all there is, you just have a function, a Skolem function, that given, if it's for all x, there is a y, that given an x has as its value the y. And you use those Skolem functions to handle the iterated quantifiers. So Friedman shows exactly what the conceptual labor that Kant thought he needed a notion of synthesis for was. It is these iterated alternating quantifiers, and that the notion of synthesis he came up with just is doing that by Skolem functions, which is provably equivalent to our quantificational way of doing it. This was just an eye-opening account. Doesn't have anything to do with normativity, but being this close in the vicinity, I couldn't resist mentioning this story. Okay, I didn't get to say everything I was hoping to say today, but there's at least stubs of it in the notes that I'll put up. Next week, we start with the stuff that's in the new book. If you didn't look at the Restall piece that was in the supplementary reading for today, it wouldn't be a bad idea to look at that for next time, but mainly reading that first chapter draft of the new book. That's the material I'll be talking about next time. So be safe, everyone, and I will see you next week.